Injustice doesn't always come loud. It walks in uniforms, smiles through authority, and speaks in the language of routine checks. On a quiet morning in a remote national park, two rangers responded to a call about a suspicious black man hiking alone. He looked calm, carried gear, and didn't flinch when questioned. Exactly the kind of presence they mistook for a threat. They saw a loner. What they didn't see was a retired Delta Force commander under federal contract. By the time they detained him, their assumptions had ignited a storm that would shake the system they thought would always protect them. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The air was thin and crisp above the tree line, where the world narrowed to sound, breath, and instinct. Pine needles crunched softly beneath Darius King's boots as he made his way along the less worn trail, one that curved away from the popular lookouts and deeper into the kind of wilderness most tourists didn't reach. Sunlight filtered through the tall evergreens in slanted gold columns, catching on particles of dust and pollen that danced like ghosts in the still air. Darius moved with practiced ease, quiet, deliberate, scanning the landscape with eyes that had long learned to calculate more than just beauty. He noted the elevation change, marked a potential bivouac site tucked under a rocky outcrop, and took down wind direction and water sources in a weatherproof notebook clipped to his chest harness. Every detail mattered, not for him, but for the veterans he hoped would walk this path next. He paused by a ridge and looked down at the small lake nestled below, untouched and shimmering like a shard of mirror. This place was ideal. Secluded but accessible, raw but navigable. The kind of terrain that tested endurance and patience without breaking the body too far. He clicked his pen once, twice, and jotted down, Camp potential. Flat. Wind-shielded. Clean water within reach. Behind him, somewhere on the distant trail, came a burst of muffled laughter. The kind that wasn't meant for him, but reached his ears anyway. Darius didn't turn, but the rhythm of his senses shifted. He stilled, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Voices, more than one, male, light tone, northern accent. Someone said something about weird timing. Another voice laughed again, quieter this time. He heard the metallic pop of a can opening. Someone said, "Just saying, that's not normal." Then, "He's still there." Darius let the sound fade before slowly standing upright. He glanced behind him, eyes scanning the tree line without turning his whole body. A cluster of tents sat just off the main path, tucked between two leaning trees where the underbrush had been cleared. They weren't hiding, but they weren't exactly making their presence known either. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and resumed walking, this time choosing a narrow incline that cut away from the visible trail. He wasn't looking to start anything. This wasn't that kind of job. He wasn't in uniform, and this wasn't combat. It was supposed to be a quiet day, a chance to get ahead on planning routes, safety checkpoints, and structure for a wilderness survival program tailored for disabled veterans. He'd spent months working with the park's leadership to secure permission. He had clearance. He had purpose. What he didn't have, clearly, was the comfort of anonymity. About 20 minutes later, Darius stopped to check his GPS coordinates. The signal flickered weakly, but held. He marked the edge of a ravine with a red surveyor's tag, recording the potential hazard in his notes. His breath was steady despite the incline, chest rising and falling beneath his vest in quiet rhythm. But something in the air still felt off, like an instrument just slightly out of tune. He knelt beside a cluster of moss, fingers brushing gently over the soft green growth as he checked for moisture levels and marked the plant type. Behind him, a branch cracked. Not a deer. Too deliberate. Someone was trying to be careful, but didn't know how. Darius rose again and scanned the horizon, slow and methodical. No one in sight. Just birdsong, wind, and the far-off lap of lake water. Still, he knew the feeling of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. And instinct didn't lie. He finished marking the area and looped back toward the trailhead, planning to head toward the eastern slope before sunset. He had maybe 3 more hours of light and didn't want to waste them. But even as he moved, he could feel the air behind him thickening with attention. Not from wildlife, from people. Back near the main junction, a white camper van had parked half off the designated gravel lot. 2 men leaned against the hood, drinking soda from red plastic cups. One woman stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes trained in his direction, as if she hadn't stopped watching since he'd passed earlier. No one waved. No one greeted. They simply stared. Darius didn't pause, didn't acknowledge them beyond a brief glance. He walked with the same quiet determination he'd carried through foreign deserts and frozen valleys, letting the silence of his presence answer questions no one had dared ask aloud yet. But something told him. Soon they would. And whatever form it took, it wouldn't come as a conversation. It would come as something that pretended to be protocol. He was already 3 turns past the main junction when he heard it. That slow, methodical crunch of tires over gravel, not rushed, but with the unmistakable weight of intention. It was not the sound of tourists or hikers pulling up to admire the view or ask for directions. No, this was a sound he recognized from a lifetime of readiness, from convoys in unmarked terrain and check-ins that always turned into something more. The low hum of a government SUV made itself known through the canopy of trees, and though he didn't turn around right away, the rhythm of his steps shifted as instinct gently curled through his chest, like a held breath. By the time he emerged onto the flat near the base of the ridge, he saw it clearly. A white and forest green Park Service vehicle, doors open, engine still running. 2 men in ranger uniforms stood just beyond the front bumper. One leaned forward slightly, a clipboard under one arm, while the other kept his hands loose at his sides. They were both dressed in tan button-ups and hiking pants, the official wide-brimmed hats shielding their eyes from the glare, but nothing about their posture looked relaxed or routine. The older one stepped forward first. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer a wave or an explanation. His voice came out clipped and direct, cutting across the open space without even the courtesy of volume adjustment. "Excuse me, need to see some ID." Darius stopped with the same composure he always had when situations turned from ordinary to something calculated. He made no sudden movements, only lifted his gaze and regarded the ranger with calm neutrality. "Can I ask what this is about?" "We got a call," the man replied, not bothering with pleasantries. "Said someone was wandering near a private campsite, possibly loitering. Description matches you. I passed one group earlier today. I stayed on the marked trail. Didn't approach or interact." The ranger didn't seem interested in clarifying anything. His eyes had already settled into that narrow squint that signaled judgment had been passed before the first word was spoken. He gestured again, sharper now. "Let me see your ID." Darius reached for the waterproof zipper pocket on his chest strap, unfastening it slowly and methodically. Inside, he carried not only his state-issued identification, but also laminated copies of his official park contract, a letter of authorization signed by Director Allison Marsh, and a copy of his terrain scouting schedule, all of which he pulled out and extended with a steady hand. The younger ranger, standing slightly behind the lead officer, took the documents silently and began to glance through them, his eyes scanning the pages with an expression that hovered somewhere between confusion and discomfort. The older ranger didn't even look at the paperwork. His gaze never left Darius. "You here alone?" "I am." "What are you doing this far out?" Darius kept his tone even as the edge in the man's voice made it clear that no answer he gave would satisfy the suspicions already bubbling just beneath the surface. I'm here as part of a contracted project with the park's leadership. I'm scouting the terrain to assess trail viability, natural hazards, and potential sites for a wilderness survival program for veterans. Director Marsh approved the plan personally. The ranger's expression didn't shift. If anything, he seemed irritated that the explanation was so calm, so clearly prepared, and so difficult to challenge outright. Funny, Marsh didn't mention anything about that to us. She wouldn't need to, Darius replied smoothly. This isn't a patrol oversight. It's administrative. You can call her to verify. Like I said, the ranger muttered, folding his arms. We got a report, and you fit the description of someone we've been monitoring. Backpack, vest, moving around the edges of campsites. Darius met the man's stare without flinching. He had heard those kinds of descriptions before. Always vague, always conveniently aligned with appearance more than action. He had no doubt what had happened. The group he'd passed had seen a solitary black man moving confidently through the woods with military gear, and had chosen not to wonder what brought him peace out here, but rather what threat he posed to theirs. You're off trail, the ranger added, clearly seeking an angle to justify the situation. That's enough cause to question you. I've stayed within 5 meters of all designated paths, except when flagging hazards. That's stated and permitted in the contract. We'll determine that, the ranger said dismissively. For now, we'll need you to come back to the station. There's no cause for detainment, Darius said, maintaining a voice that did not rise, but settled with force. You have my credentials. You can contact your director and have this resolved in 10 minutes. She's not available, the ranger said quickly. The younger ranger's eyes flicked over, uncertain. He looked at the older man as if tempted to interject, but didn't. Darius exhaled slowly, not in frustration, in calculation. Then I suggest you record everything from this moment forward, he said, retrieving his documents as they were handed back. Because I will. And if you choose not to verify who I am when you've been given every opportunity to do so, the consequences will be yours. The ranger didn't reply. Instead, he turned toward the vehicle, gesturing with his head. The younger one followed, still quiet, his grip tightening briefly on the radio at his hip before releasing it. Darius didn't need confirmation to know what that hesitation meant. The younger one knew something wasn't right, but he wasn't going to speak up. Not yet. Darius adjusted his backpack with a calm that was practiced, not passive. It was the kind of calm that came from years of diffusing more dangerous encounters with less justification. He fell in step behind the rangers as they led him down the incline toward the gravel road where the SUV waited. The sun had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows over the trail, and the temperature had dipped just enough for the wind to carry a sharper edge. Every step of the walk back felt weighted, not by fear, but by the knowledge of how close a situation like this could spiral, and how easily the story could be rewritten if he didn't stay in complete control. The lead ranger opened the back door of the SUV without looking at him. You can sit in the back until we get this sorted. I'm not under arrest, Darius said, his voice firm but controlled. So I'll stand. You're being detained while we verify your presence in the park. Sitting is safer, for both of us. I'm not a threat, Darius said, unflinching. And if you believed I was, you wouldn't be standing 3 feet away without your hand on your weapon. That earned a moment's pause. The ranger's jaw shifted slightly, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stepped aside, clearly unwilling to escalate physically, but also unwilling to acknowledge that Darius had a point. I'll ride, but I'm not sitting like a suspect, Darius said. The ranger muttered something under his breath and climbed into the front seat. The younger one hesitated, glancing at Darius as if trying to find a way to make it less humiliating, then said nothing and entered behind the wheel. Darius pulled the passenger door open, climbed in carefully, and buckled in without instruction. The ride back to the ranger station was long enough to feel intentional, winding through forest paths and dirt roads with no conversation except for occasional radio static and the rustling of paperwork. The SUV smelled like pine and leather, clean but clinical, and Darius kept his eyes forward, watching the way the trees thinned as they approached the clearing. When the building came into view, a squat, low-roofed ranger station with a U.S. flag hanging slack in the still air, he made note of the security cameras at the corners and the outdated radio antenna leaning slightly on the roof. The walls were timber, likely meant to blend into the surroundings, but the heavy glass door and the barred windows told him what the real function was. This wasn't a welcome center. It was a holding place, a checkpoint, a gate disguised as a shelter. The SUV rolled to a stop, and without a word, both rangers exited. Darius stepped out as well, stretching slightly to keep his posture loose. No sudden movements. Nothing that could be used against him. He didn't bother reaching for his documents again. They already knew who he was, or could have, if they had any interest in knowing. Inside, the air was cooler. The floors were clean, but scuffed, the kind of wear that came from boots and tension rather than foot traffic. A desk sat against the wall with an old monitor flickering quietly behind it. A younger ranger, no more than 25, looked up from behind the counter and gave a stiff nod as they entered. He clearly hadn't been briefed on anything. "In here," Crane said, motioning toward a side room with a long table, a window, and no clock. Darius stepped in, standing behind the chair they'd clearly expected him to take. "I won't be sitting until someone calls Director Marsh," he said evenly. "She's unavailable," Crane replied, setting down a folder he hadn't looked at once during the trip. "She's your superior," Darius said, "and if you're detaining someone for an investigation that falls under her jurisdiction, you're obligated to notify her or someone in her office." "We're following procedure." "No, you're not," Darius said, still not raising his voice. "You're following suspicion, and you're trying to mask it as authority." The younger ranger shifted his weight again, then walked out of the room under the pretense of checking on something, leaving Crane alone with Darius. Silence fell again, the kind that wasn't empty, but filled with the slow, ticking weight of injustice, as it unfolded in real time. Darius rested his hands on the back of the chair, gripping it lightly, his knuckles relaxed, but ready. The room seemed to shrink, and somewhere in the quiet of his mind, another room appeared. Dimmer, hotter, sand and dust floating in the air, a cement compound in another country, a checkpoint gone wrong, a younger version of himself standing in almost the same position, arms loose, heart steady, eyes fixed on men who didn't believe in his peace, but feared his silence. That moment had ended without violence because he had chosen for it to end that way. This one would too. But just like then, the consequences would not fade after the door opened. Back in the ranger station, he broke the silence once more. "You still have time to correct this," he said. "You have my credentials. You have a working radio. Call her." Crane didn't move. His arms were crossed now, as if folding them could shield him from accountability. "We'll sort it out. Sit tight. Every moment you refuse to verify my identity is another moment you expose this department to liability," Darius said. "You've made the mistake, but how you choose to move forward will determine whether this ends with a conversation or with a courtroom." He simply said, with quiet certainty, "You're all going to remember this day, because I won't let the world forget it." The door creaked open behind them, and the younger ranger stepped back inside, his eyes darting between the two men. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he swallowed it down and stayed silent. Darius didn't turn. He simply said, with quiet certainty, You're all going to remember this day, because I won't let the world forget it." No one replied. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the kind that filled every corner of the room with the sound of restraint. The older ranger, Crane, folded his arms and leaned against the wall like a man waiting for a clock to save him from his own misjudgment. The younger one lingered for a moment longer, then retreated back into the hallway as if he could feel the temperature of the truth rising behind him. Eventually, they left Darius alone. The door shut with a muted click, and with it, the thin illusion of professionalism dissolved into something colder. The room had no windows to the outside, just a narrow pane of glass along the interior wall that looked into a corridor lined with old file cabinets and faded park posters. There was a small metal chair and a rectangular table bolted to the floor. The kind of setup meant to feel like protocol, but carried the quiet cruelty of suspicion. Darius remained standing. He had no interest in sitting down just because someone wanted to see him lower himself. His body had known harsher conditions. Deserts, where the heat pressed into your skin like ash. Drop zones where the sky offered no mercy. But this room carried a different weight. It was the weight of knowing that after everything he had done for his country, after every mission, every order followed, every life risked and saved, it still only took one phone call and a passing glance for a man like him to become a question mark instead of a name. The minutes stretched into a slow crawl, then into an hour, then more. There was no update, no knock on the door. No one came to offer water or an explanation, or the courtesy of time acknowledged, just the sound of faint voices beyond the wall and the occasional crackle of a radio. Darius stood still. His mind drifted, not in frustration, but in reflection, not at what was being done to him, but at how many times it had been done to others, at how many rooms like this existed across the country, quiet and unseen, built not with bricks, but with assumptions. He thought about the veterans he worked with, men and women who had lost limbs and families and sleep, who were trying to find pieces of themselves again in the stillness of the wild. What would happen to one of them if they came here alone on a scouting trip and someone called them suspicious? What if they didn't have the patience he had? What if they broke? The thought dug in, because it wasn't just about him. It never was. A faint knock finally sounded on the door, not the hard, deliberate kind used by authority, but a softer, almost hesitant one. The door opened halfway, and the younger ranger stepped in again, holding a paper cup of water and a look that didn't match the uniform he wore. "I thought you might need this," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of protocol. Darius didn't move from his place. He didn't reach for the cup. He didn't respond with gratitude. He simply looked at the man, not with anger, but with a quiet question he didn't need to ask aloud. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" The ranger set the cup down on the table and stood there for a moment longer. His jaw tensed, like he was chewing on a decision. Then he turned and left, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him, as if he couldn't bring himself to shut it again. More time passed. And then, finally, movement. Boots against tile. A clipped voice at the front desk. The creak of the door as it swung wide open. And this time, the presence that filled the room didn't carry the weight of suspicion. It carried authority. "Darius!" He turned slowly, and when his eyes met hers, the change in energy was instant. Allison Marsh, Director of Wilderness Operations for the Western Region, stood in the doorway, a tablet under one arm and disbelief written plainly across her face. She stepped into the room without hesitation, her gaze sweeping once around the sparse interior before settling fully on him. "What is going on?" she asked, not to him, but to the figures trailing behind her. Ranger Crane included, now visibly uneasy under her scrutiny. "I've been here for over 2 hours," Darius said calmly. "Detained without cause. Repeatedly asked that you be contacted." "I was never called," Marsh said, turning toward the others. "Not once. What possible reason could you have had for not reaching out to me immediately?" Crane started to speak, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "You all know exactly who this man is. He's here under my direct authority. He's under contract with the department. He's part of a national partnership we're developing with the VA. He is not a suspect. He is a senior advisor, a decorated veteran. And you've had him locked in a holding room like a criminal?" She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her words were like cold air breaking through heat, sharp, undeniable, and immediate. Crane looked away, his mouth tightening. The younger ranger hovered near the hallway, no longer trying to hide his discomfort. "I want a written report by end of day," Marsh continued, "from both of you. And I want a meeting scheduled with legal and compliance. This isn't going away." She turned back to Darius, her expression shifting from fury to something more complex. Shame, recognition, apology. "I'm so sorry, Darius," she said, her voice lower now. "This never should have happened." Darius didn't nod. He didn't offer reassurances. He simply looked her in the eye and said, "It did happen. And now, we deal with it." The moment Director Marsh stepped aside and nodded for him to leave, Darius walked out of that room without looking back. He didn't collect the water cup. He didn't acknowledge the glances that followed him down the narrow hallway. He didn't offer words to the younger ranger who stood half-shadowed by the doorframe, uncertain if he should apologize or vanish. Darius simply moved forward, one foot in front of the other, the same way he had in the field. Not because the trail was easy, but because stopping would give the wrong story too much time to write itself. Outside, the sun was lower now, dipping behind the edge of the ridge line and casting long amber lines across the gravel. His truck was still parked where he'd left it earlier that morning. Nothing about it had changed, but the air around it felt different, like the terrain itself had shifted, as if this quiet patch of the Pacific Northwest now carried the echo of something it didn't want to admit. Marsh caught up to him before he reached the vehicle. "Darius," she said, not using her title now, not speaking like an administrator trying to preserve protocol. "I need you to know I didn't know. If I had—" He turned to her, calm but unmoved. "You didn't. And that's the problem." Her expression tightened, but she didn't argue. She was smart enough to know that sometimes silence was the only responsible response. "I've already reported it to compliance," she said. "There'll be disciplinary review. You'll be looped into anything you choose. The department will issue an apology. I'll write it myself." Darius looked past her toward the trees. Their edges swayed gently in the early evening breeze, the same trees that had witnessed everything, the same trail that had welcomed his steps, but not protected them. "I don't want a letter," he said. Marsh straightened slightly, uncertain. "Then what do you want?" "I want this on record," he said. "I want it documented, not buried under procedure. I want every ranger in this state to go through anti-bias training, not because it's legally required, but because it's long overdue. And I want every black veteran who sets foot on this land to know they're not alone when someone stares too long or calls their presence suspicious. I want truth, on paper." She nodded slowly, her face unreadable, her hands clasped at her waist. "You'll have it," she said. Without another word, Darius opened the door to his truck, climbed in, and started the engine. It rumbled to life beneath him, steady and familiar. As he pulled onto the gravel road and began the long descent back toward the main highway, he didn't look back at the station. He didn't need to. The confrontation was over. But the reckoning had only just begun. It was nearly dark when he reached the quiet pull-off just beyond the tree line, a clearing he'd marked months ago as a reliable stop point for trail safety checks. He parked, turned off the engine, and stepped into the silence of the woods again. Not to scout this time, but to think. Leaning against the hood of his truck, he pulled out the same waterproof notebook he'd used earlier that day. The first few pages were filled with trail data, elevation marks, potential camp zones, and environmental notes. But now he flipped to the back, opened to a blank page, and began writing. He didn't write with emotion. He wrote with precision. Date, time, location, names, details. Every word was clear, deliberate, and factual. Every action he described was grounded in what was said, what was not, who stood where, and how long they chose silence over responsibility. He knew this wasn't just for him. It was for the file that would eventually become part of something larger. A complaint, a motion, a case, maybe even a precedent. After the report was outlined and folded back into his vest, he reached for his phone. The signal was faint, but it connected. He scrolled through his contacts until he reached the name he hadn't used in nearly a year. Lauren Reyes, civil rights attorney. She answered on the third ring. "Darius," she said, her voice alert even through the static. "You don't call unless something's happened." "I need to file a formal civil rights complaint," he said, "against the Park Service, specifically 2 rangers at Cascadia National. I have documentation, witnesses, and a signed contract they ignored while detaining me." There was a brief pause. Then, "Give me a summary now. We'll go over the rest tomorrow." He didn't start with emotions. He didn't open with outrage. He delivered it the same way he had when reporting post-op status during missions. Detailed, structured, controlled. She asked questions. He answered. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer platitudes. She listened, like someone who had built a career out of turning moments like this into movement. When the call ended, the quiet returned. But it no longer felt like isolation. It felt like readiness. Darius stood still for a while longer, letting the last of the evening light slip through the tree branches above him. The same woods where they had questioned his presence were now the same woods that bore witness to his intent. They had tried to reduce him to a shadow, a suspicion, a silent figure to be removed from the landscape. But what they didn't understand, what they still hadn't learned, was that men like him didn't disappear. They documented. They fought. They returned. And when they returned, they didn't come alone. By Monday morning, the complaint was officially filed. It sat on the desk of the State Office of Civil Rights in Olympia, stamped and logged with a case number, accompanied by the full text of Darius King's sworn statement, 6 attached exhibits including his contract, park access letter, GPS data, and a notarized affidavit from Director Allison Marsh. The tone of the document was not inflammatory. It was exact. It did not shout, but it did not bend. Every line built a case not only for unlawful detainment and racial profiling, but for a systemic failure in how authorities saw, judged, and moved against men who looked like him in public space. Lauren Reyes had handled the language. Darius had provided the structure. Together, they made sure the truth was presented in a way that couldn't be softened by bureaucracy. 3 days after the filing, the media began to circle. It started as a quiet murmur. A local journalist who had followed previous park controversies caught wind of the complaint and sent a polite request for comment. Then came a segment on the evening news. Veteran detained in National Park. Was it racial profiling? The headline did not include his name, not yet, but the story showed his image. A photo of him in uniform, taken during an event years ago, paired with a current image of him on a wilderness trail, head slightly turned, eyes calm but alert. By the end of the week, the story had moved beyond regional. Major outlets began to request interviews. Emails poured into Lauren's office asking for statements. Comment threads lit up, some in support, others bristling with the same coded defensiveness that had led to the incident in the first place. Darius ignored the noise. He didn't have time for internet arguments or performative outrage. He was too busy working. Each morning, he continued building the curriculum for the Veterans Survival Program. The mission hadn't changed. The method hadn't shifted. But now, his work carried a second current. Every presentation, every slide deck, every proposal he refined was filtered through the knowledge that visibility had come, not by choice, but by necessity. The trail had always been his sanctuary. Now, it was his stage. The Park Service, unaccustomed to being the target of sustained scrutiny, responded the only way institutions knew how, through carefully managed language and the art of saying everything and nothing at once. The first press release arrived on a Friday afternoon. It was 3 paragraphs of administrative apology without ownership. Phrases like reviewing internal protocols and committed to equitable access for all visitors floated between lines that carefully avoided mentioning race, detainment, or names. It did not reference the rangers involved. It did not address the direct violation of Darius's contract or the 3-hour window in which no effort was made to contact the park's own director. Instead, it leaned on the shield of pending investigation, citing policy reassessment and a desire to preserve the public's trust. Darius read it twice. Then he closed the browser window. Lauren called that evening. "They're going to try to settle early," she said. "Not out of guilt, out of fear." "I'm not interested in a check," he replied. "I know. That's why they'll panic." She paused. "I've done dozens of these cases, Darius. They expect anger, outbursts, emotional pleas. They know how to play those down in court. But what they don't know how to fight is what you're doing. Steady truth. No theatrics. Just evidence. That's what scares them." He didn't answer immediately. He was standing in his kitchen, cutting vegetables for dinner, the knife steady in his hand as if it had never left the rhythm of survival. It wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about fame. It was about the right to exist, to move through public space without being dragged into a box built by someone else's imagination. "Let them be scared," he said finally. Later that night, after the sky had gone black and the phone had stopped buzzing with alerts, Darius sat at his desk and pulled out the same notebook he had used on the trail. He flipped to a fresh page and began to write again. Not strategy this time, not a report or a timeline, but something slower, something rooted in memory. He wrote about his first deployment, about the first time he walked through an unfamiliar village and felt eyes land on his body like heat, about how trust was something you built with every breath and step, and how even then, in a war zone, you could sometimes feel more respected than you did in your own country, because at least there, they didn't pretend not to see you. They saw you clearly, as threat or ally, but not invisible. He wrote about the veterans he trained, the amputee who had cried the first time he pitched his own tent, the woman who hadn't spoken for weeks but smiled the moment she made fire on her own. He wrote about how healing didn't always come from medicine or therapy. It came from reclaiming space, from knowing you had a right to be in the wild, that the trees didn't judge, that the rocks didn't ask for ID, but people did. And they always would, unless someone forced the system to confront what it had been allowed to ignore. The next morning, a new article ran with his full name. Retired Delta Force Commander files civil rights lawsuit after detainment by park rangers. Below the headline was a quote. "It wasn't the detainment that stayed with me. It was the silence around it, the assumption that nothing would be said and nothing would be done." Darius hadn't written that for them. He hadn't spoken it in an interview. It had come from one of his filings, pulled from the public court documents, highlighted by a journalist who understood that the quietest lines sometimes cut the deepest. The echo had begun. Now it would carry. The conference room Lauren Reyes used for her client meetings was tucked in the back of a mid-rise office building just outside Tacoma. It wasn't sleek or showy. There were no leather-bound chairs or glass-topped tables, no modern art trying too hard to impress. Just a solid oak desk, a cabinet of case files, and a wall lined with books that had been read and reread, their spines bent with use, their margins marked with quiet war. She didn't need her office to intimidate. Her words did that well enough on their own. Darius sat across from her, hands folded, posture straight, gaze level. She had already prepared the framework: legal precedent, statute language, comparator cases, all printed and color-coded in the binder she slid toward him. But today wasn't about paperwork. Today was about voice. "I need your official deposition," she said, her tone clipped, not unkind but clear. "This one's under oath. It'll be entered into the court record and can be used in discovery. I'll guide you through it, but the words have to be yours." He nodded once. A small recorder on the table clicked on. A red light blinked. Lauren didn't ask if he was ready. She already knew he was. "State your name and occupation for the record." "Darius Elijah King. I'm the founder and lead instructor for Summit Reach Wilderness Training, a nonprofit program that provides survival courses and nature-based rehabilitation for military veterans, particularly those with physical or psychological trauma. I'm also a retired Delta Force commander." "On what date did the incident in question occur?" "May 2nd of this year." "Where?" "Cascadia National Park." "Western Ridge, near the northern perimeter of the secondary trail system." "Sector B3. Why were you there?" "I was conducting a pre-approved terrain assessment for an upcoming veteran training program scheduled to begin this fall. I was under contract with the Parks Administrative Office, working directly with Director Allison Marsh. I had all required permits and documentation on my person." Lauren didn't look up as she wrote, but Darius could tell she wasn't missing a breath, wasn't missing a beat. "Describe the sequence of events leading to your detainment." He recounted it carefully. His entry into the park, his decision to scout deeper areas near the slope, the distant voices from the campers, the tension that shadowed his steps. He described the vehicle that approached, the uniforms of the Rangers, the first words spoken without greeting or introduction. He recited what he said, what he showed, how they responded. Each moment layered with precision. No embellishment, no dramatization, just the facts, but held steady with the weight of someone who had been trained to notice everything. Lauren occasionally asked him to pause, to repeat a phrase, to clarify whether someone raised their voice or if certain words had been used verbatim. When she asked about the phrase, "You fit the description," he leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing with a memory that hadn't dulled. "That line was used after I had already shown them my identification, after I presented my park contract, and after I explained my purpose on the trail. It was not used as an initial cause. It was added as justification." "And what did you believe they meant by that?" "I believe they meant I fit the image in their heads of someone who didn't belong out there. Not because of my actions, not because of any legitimate report, but because of my race, my gear, and the fact that I was alone." Lauren looked up now. Her pen hovered mid-air. "And how did you respond to that judgment?" "I stayed calm. I didn't escalate. I made repeated requests that they contact Director Marsh. I documented everything I could. I did not resist detainment, though I made it clear I did not consent to being treated as a suspect." "What did you feel during those hours?" The question wasn't procedural. It wasn't even necessary for the deposition. It was for the record in a different way, an acknowledgement that the law wasn't just built on facts, but on what those facts did to people. I felt dismissed, Darius said, not as a contractor, not as a veteran, but as a person. I wasn't seen as someone who had earned the right to be there. I was seen as a threat until proven otherwise. And even when proven otherwise, the suspicion remained. I've faced enemies. I've faced danger. But I have never felt so quietly erased as I did in that ranger station. Lauren didn't write that last part down. She didn't need to. She already knew it would live in the jury's mind long after the paperwork was done. When the recorder stopped, she leaned back in her chair and studied him for a moment. "I'm going to bring in a few more voices," she said. "Other veterans from your program, men and women you've trained. They can speak to your reputation, your purpose, your impact, and, if they're willing, how they've felt walking through spaces that weren't designed to welcome them." Darius nodded. "They'll speak," he said. "They've lived this too." Over the next 2 weeks, Lauren built the case the same way Darius had built trail strategy, layer by layer, no missteps. She filed motions, responded to Park Service stall tactics, countered the flood of administrative denials with receipts and records. Each time the opposing legal team tried to shift the narrative toward procedure, she brought it back to people. She wove the testimonies of veterans into the core of the case, grounding legal argument in lived experience. These weren't abstractions. These were individuals who had bled for their country, only to return to a society still uncertain about what to do with their presence. One veteran spoke about being asked to show ID while birdwatching with his daughter. Another described how a park ranger once followed him for over an hour because he looked unfamiliar on the trail. These weren't outliers. They were patterns. Lauren wrapped them together like a net, one the department wouldn't be able to slip through. And through it all, Darius never wavered. He gave the same calm interviews, answered every question, reviewed every brief. He didn't give the public theatrics or fury. He gave them a reminder that silence could be broken, and that justice, once spoken clearly enough, could not be unheard. The story, once confined to legal filings and quiet meetings, began to ripple outward like a wind disturbing the surface of still water. At first, it was small. Local blogs, advocacy pages, regional outlets giving it a headline slot in their weekend editions. But that ripple carried weight, and by the end of the month, it reached Michael Grant. Grant wasn't just another journalist chasing outrage. He was one of those rare writers who didn't just report what happened. He told you why it mattered. His bylines had covered human rights violations in conflict zones, the criminalization of protest in major cities, and the hidden toll of PTSD in veterans returning home. When he read the court filings and saw Darius's name, something clicked. This wasn't just another headline. This was a fault line, one that had gone unnoticed beneath the surface until someone had the discipline to trace it all the way back to its source. His request for an interview came through Lauren's office. Darius took a few days to consider it, not out of reluctance, but because he knew once he spoke, it wouldn't be just about the lawsuit anymore. It would be about what the lawsuit represented. When they met, it wasn't in a studio or staged office. It was on a trail, neutral ground. They walked for nearly a mile before Grant pulled out his recorder, and even then, he didn't lead with questions. He just walked, matching Darius's pace, listening to the cadence of his footsteps, as if waiting for permission to begin. "You've been quiet, considering how loud this story's gotten," Grant said eventually. "I've said everything I needed to in the documents," Darius replied, not stopping. "The rest is for people like you. But they'll listen if it comes from you. They're already listening. The question is what they'll do with what they hear." Grant's feature dropped 2 days later. The headline didn't scream. It didn't sensationalize. It simply read, "A man on the trail, the veteran who refused to disappear." It opened with a single image. Darius standing at the tree line, backpack slung over one shoulder, face calm, eyes focused not on the camera, but on the path ahead. The piece traced his military career, the years of elite service, the founding of Summit Reach, the contracts with the National Park System. But it wasn't just a biography. It was an indictment. Grant walked readers through the detention, the failed calls, the silence of those who should have spoken. He quoted Mills's quiet confession, Crane's floundering contradictions, the list of past complaints tucked into back-office drawers. But most importantly, he centered Darius, not as a symbol, not as a spectacle, but as a man who had given everything to his country only to be questioned for walking in its wilderness. The impact was immediate. Within hours, the article trended on major platforms. Comment sections filled with outrage and recognition. Veterans from across the country began sharing their own stories, some quiet, some furious, all familiar. One man from Georgia posted a photo of his own encounter with law enforcement in a state park, where he'd been told he looked like he was scouting for trouble. A woman from Colorado recounted being stopped 3 times on the same hiking trip. Each post added to the growing chorus. The hashtag Right to Roam emerged overnight. It wasn't created by a marketing team. It wasn't polished. It was born in the comments section of a retired Army medic who simply wrote, "We fought for this land. We have the right to walk it." From there, it took on a life of its own. Veteran groups began to organize solidarity hikes, not as protests, but as affirmations. Dozens of them shared photos of themselves on trails, holding signs with phrases like, "My pack isn't a threat," and "Nature belongs to us too." Darius never asked for any of it, but his presence had become the spark. Donations poured into Summit Reach. Not in the millions, but in steady, meaningful waves, $20, $50, sometimes more, always accompanied by notes that said things like, "Thank you for walking that path when we couldn't," or "I never thought someone would tell our story like that." Even the legal system, slow and resistant as it was, began to shift beneath the pressure. The Park Service issued a second statement, longer this time, with language that bordered on admission. They didn't name Crane directly, but they acknowledged individual actions inconsistent with departmental values. They announced a review of all ranger incidents from the past 5 years. They promised bias training, community engagement, and a new complaint audit process. But it was too late for vague promises. The public wasn't asking any more. They were demanding. And in the eye of the storm, Darius remained unchanged. He spoke only when necessary. He answered questions with precision, never with performance. He never claimed to speak for all veterans, or all black hikers, or anyone else. He simply told the truth, and trusted that people would recognize themselves in it. One night, as the lawsuit continued its slow march toward trial, Lauren sat across from him at his kitchen table. The noise outside had quieted for a moment, but the momentum hadn't slowed. "They're afraid of you," she said. Not as a compliment, but as a realization. Darius looked at her. "I'm not the one they should be afraid of." "Then who?" "The ones coming after me," he said. "The ones who aren't going to wait as long as I did to speak." And with that, the conversation turned back to the trail maps on the table. Routes for the next program, locations for the Veteran Hike series, contingency plans for wilderness emergencies. Because the lawsuit was important, the truth was important, but the work was not going to stop just because the world had finally started to listen. Long before the lawsuit had made headlines, before hashtags and hikes and press conferences, the complaints had already existed. They just hadn't mattered. Until now. In the weeks following the viral surge of Darius's story, something began to shift within the walls of the Park Service, not in their official statements, which remained polished and careful, but in the spaces between them. Inside emails, in hurried phone calls, in off-the-record conversations shared in hushed tones between ranger station break rooms and administrative hallways. There was a tension, palpable and growing, as if everyone knew the dam was cracking and were simply waiting to see where the first burst would rupture. The first internal leak came from a seasonal employee, someone who had worked 2 summers at Cascadia but had never stayed past October. She sent an anonymous tip to Michael Grant's inbox, a short message signed only with the initials KL. This isn't the first time. Check the 2019 logbooks. 3 hikers detained without clear cause. No charges, no reports filed, just incident resolved. Crane was involved every time. I was told to shred 2 of the statements. Grant verified the message, then passed it on to Lauren. Within hours, her team filed a discovery request for disciplinary files and internal complaints related to Ranger Philip Crane. The park's legal team resisted at first, citing privacy clauses and departmental process. But the court sided with transparency, and what emerged was worse than anyone had anticipated. In a stack of archived logs and redacted memos, Lauren uncovered 7 separate incidents involving Crane over the last 5 years. 4 were labeled as informal interactions with no formal write-up. 2 were closed without disciplinary action. 1 had been buried entirely, marked with the internal tag "Issue de-escalated, no further review required." Each incident shared a common thread. The individual questioned had been a person of color. In nearly all of them, the justification cited was non-compliant body language, aggressive silence, or unverified presence. Never behavior, never threats. Just presence that didn't match the ranger's expectation of what a safe hiker looked like. The oldest complaint was from 2016, filed by a black high school teacher from Portland who had been stopped while taking photos with her students during a summer ecology program. She was separated from her group and held for 45 minutes while Crane verified her credentials, despite her having a state-issued education ID and a formal permit. Her complaint had never been followed up on. But the revelations didn't end with the reports. As word spread that someone was finally challenging the system and being heard, former and current employees began to speak out, some anonymously, others with names attached. They weren't all tied to Crane, but they all painted the same picture: a culture that operated on silence and proximity to power. A system that punished rangers for raising concerns and promoted those who followed orders without asking questions. A retired ranger named James Hill, who had spent 20 years in the service before quietly stepping away, agreed to speak with Grant on record. His statement ran alongside a follow-up article titled "The Culture of Compliance: What Darius King's Lawsuit Has Uncovered." "I tried to report Crane in 2018, Hill told him. Not for one incident, but for a pattern. He had a way of interpreting confidence as defiance, especially in black men. I watched him escalate things that didn't need escalation. I filed a concern. It never left the local supervisor's desk. I got reassigned to the Northern District 2 months later. No explanation. Just moved." Other stories followed. A Latina ranger who had been warned not to get involved in politics when she questioned Crane's treatment of a teenage camper. A white administrative assistant who remembered being told to delete an audio file from a complaint call because it would only complicate things. An environmental educator who had resigned quietly after watching a family of Somali hikers be pulled aside, questioned, and told to avoid certain trails, without reason, without report, and without apology. The press picked up every thread. What had started as one story about one man in one moment had become something else entirely. a spotlight illuminating the quiet rot inside an institution that had, for too long, depended on the invisibility of its own power. The Department of the Interior was forced to respond. They issued a second press statement, this one longer and more pointed, acknowledging concerns raised by current and former staff and promising an immediate audit of ranger conduct at Cascadia and surrounding districts. They announced the formation of an independent review board and a temporary suspension of field duties for any ranger with a pending complaint under investigation. But for many, it felt too late. Public trust had already begun to erode, not just in Cascadia, but across the country, as hikers and park visitors began sharing their own experiences under the banner of Right to Roam. Photos flooded social media, Black veterans in uniform standing at trailheads, indigenous families holding up their tribal land permits after being stopped in national forests, mixed-race couples recounting cold shoulders and quiet warnings from uniformed staff. None of the stories were violent, but all of them carried the same weight. Not welcome, not safe, not ours. And yet, even in the surge of support and revelation, Darius remained steady. He read every article, scanned every message, and responded only when needed. He didn't celebrate the leaks or gloat over the department's unraveling. He knew that exposing a system didn't fix it. The truth had to be followed by action, or it would fade like every other outrage that came before it. At a press conference held by Lauren's team outside the courthouse, a reporter asked him how he felt about the past complaints surfacing. "I'm not surprised," Darius said. "I'm disappointed that it took this long to listen. And what do you want to see come out of this?" "Accountability," he said without hesitation. "And not just for individuals, but for the structures that allowed them to keep repeating the same harm unchecked. I want to see systems rebuilt so no one has to become a headline just to be believed." That line ran the next morning in bold, across the front page of a major national paper. It was shared by celebrities, veterans groups, even sitting members of Congress. Grant called it the calmest rallying cry he'd ever heard. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted on park leadership to act swiftly. Crane, placed on administrative leave during the investigation, had already retained his own legal counsel. Mills had quietly requested a transfer. Meanwhile, whistleblowers were being protected under emergency orders, and every single complaint previously marked as resolved informally was being reopened. Lauren stood at the center of it all, coordinating statements, managing reporters, and preparing for the next phase of the trial. But one evening, after a long meeting ended and the office had emptied out, she walked out onto the back patio, where Darius stood alone, looking up at the trees above. "They're unraveling," she said. "They were always unraveling," he replied. "Now we're just watching the thread." "And Crane?" she asked. "Do you think he understands what he did?" Darius took a long breath, then exhaled slowly. "I don't think it matters. This was never just about him. He was a symptom. The question is whether the body wants to heal, or if it'll just hide the wound again." Lauren said nothing. There was nothing more to add. Not yet. Because the trial hadn't started. The verdict hadn't been written. But already, the walls were no longer silent. The past had a voice now, and it was loud. They approached quietly. No press release, no meeting request stamped with urgency. Just a manila envelope slid across the table in a private room at the district courthouse. An envelope that spoke in numbers instead of language. Inside was a proposed settlement agreement, $600,000 in financial restitution, a confidentiality clause, and a paragraph buried deep in the fine print that offered a vague promise of departmental improvements with no binding mechanism to enforce them. Darius didn't even touch the envelope. He looked at it, glanced once at the assistant city attorney seated across from him, and then turned his gaze to Lauren. "You don't have to answer now," the attorney said, his tone deliberately even, as if he was trying to make the room feel less like what it was, a room where silence was being bought. Lauren didn't speak either. She simply leaned back in her chair, giving Darius the space he needed. He didn't need long. "I'm not settling," he said, voice quiet, but rooted in the same certainty he had carried since that morning on the trail. The attorney cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. "This is a generous offer. It acknowledges—" "No, it doesn't," Darius said, cutting through the diplomatic language. "It acknowledges that they're afraid of what comes next. That's not the same thing as responsibility." Lauren watched the man's composure fracture just slightly, like a mask slipping. "We're willing to consider public language adjustments, an apology from the department, if that's what your client wants." "I want structural reform," Darius said. "I want a legally binding agreement that mandates a full accountability framework across the Park Service. Not just here, but everywhere they operate. I want third-party oversight on all complaints involving park personnel and civilian detainment. I want bias training that's measured by results, not attendance sheets. And I want my veteran program funded not as a concession, but as a commitment." The attorney looked down at his notes. "That's not a settlement. That's a policy overhaul." "That's right," Darius said. "I'm not here for a payout. I'm here so the next time a veteran walks into a national park, they don't have to carry their military record like a shield. They just walk." There was nothing left to say. The envelope stayed where it was, unopened, unaccepted, irrelevant. After they left the courthouse that day, Lauren caught up to him outside, her heels tapping against the pavement as she fell into step beside him. She didn't ask if he was sure. She didn't question his resolve. She simply said, "They're going to fight harder now." "I expect them to," he said. "Systems don't give up power. They shift the battlefield." She looked over at him and nodded, her expression unreadable but grounded. "Then let's make sure we win on every front." And they did. In the weeks that followed his refusal, the tone of the public conversation changed. What began as outrage over an individual incident transformed into momentum for reform. Darius's Veterans Program, Summit Reach, became more than a training initiative. It became a blueprint. News networks covered their model in primetime segments. Educational institutions reached out to partner. Veterans advocacy organizations nominated Darius for national recognition. But he remained focused. Not on accolades, not on approval, but on implementation. He expanded the program's curriculum, adding legal literacy modules that taught former service members how to navigate public spaces where they might be profiled. He secured outdoor spaces across 3 additional states. He built community partnerships with indigenous land stewards to ensure the trails they used were rooted in shared respect. And perhaps most powerfully, he began organizing what came to be known as the Returning Walk, a nationwide veteran-led hike through major parks across the country, including Cascadia, where it all began. The walk wasn't a march. It wasn't a protest. It was exactly what the name suggested: a return, a reclaiming of space, a message, delivered without fists or slogans, that they had always belonged. The first event drew over 1,000 veterans, their families and supporters. Some in wheelchairs, others with prosthetics, many with visible scars, and even more with the kind you couldn't see. Darius led the hike without fanfare. He carried the same pack he'd worn that day on the ridge. He spoke very little, choosing instead to walk beside others, to listen. Midway through the trail, a young man, barely 20, with a Ranger unit tattoo on his forearm, caught up to him. "You ever think they'll actually change?" he asked. Darius didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the tree line, where the sun caught the edges of the evergreens and turned them gold. "They already are," he said. "They just don't know it yet." The image of that walk, the long trail of hikers stretching across the horizon, led by the man who refused to disappear, became one of the most widely shared photographs of the year. It was picked up by every major outlet, displayed on banners at advocacy summits, and printed on the back of a brochure for the Department of the Interior's own policy reform announcement. That announcement, issued under mounting legal and public pressure, confirmed what Darius had fought for: a national oversight body for civilian complaints within park systems, mandatory anti-bias and de-escalation training with third-party audits, funding for outdoor access programs led by underrepresented veteran communities, and a formal agreement with Summit Reach Wilderness Training to operate as a national partner. When the news broke, Darius didn't speak at a podium. He didn't schedule a press conference. Instead, he stood at the edge of a trail in Utah, overseeing a new group of veterans as they learned to pitch tents on uneven ground and purify stream water with homemade filters. He watched them laugh, really laugh, for the first time in years. Lauren sent him the announcement in a short email with only one line beneath the attachment. They blinked first. He replied with just 2 words: "Keep walking." The courtroom was smaller than the public expected. No high ceilings or polished oak walls, just pale carpeting, fluorescent lights, and the rustle of legal pads shifting as people settled into the gallery seats. But what it lacked in grandeur, it made up for in weight. Every seat was filled. Journalists lined the back wall, their notepads ready, their phones off, but their attention electric. Veterans sat in clusters, men and women from every walk of service, their presence a quiet bulwark behind the plaintiff's table. Darius sat beside Lauren, his expression unreadable. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, his posture composed, but not stiff. He didn't fidget. He didn't whisper. He simply waited. The trial began with procedural clarity, introductions, evidence logs, and jury selection that had taken nearly 3 days to finalize. Then came opening statements. The park's legal team opened with an attempt at neutralizing the language, casting the incident as a miscommunication compounded by incomplete internal guidance. But the jury didn't shift in their seats. They listened blankly, almost bored, as if already used to hearing institutions try to sterilize what had clearly become a public reckoning. Lauren's statement was shorter. Darius King followed every rule, carried every document, honored every contract. He was detained anyway. This trial is about what happens when authority stops asking questions and starts assuming guilt based on who someone is, not what they've done. We will show that this wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a pattern, ignored, protected, and now exposed. Then came the witnesses. Ranger Ethan Mills was called first. He walked to the stand with hesitance, his shoulders rolled inward, his gaze downcast. He took the oath and sat with hands clasped, answering questions in the same tone he had used during deposition. Low, unguarded, and clear. "I didn't feel threatened," he said plainly when asked about Darius. "He wasn't doing anything wrong. He cooperated, showed ID, gave us his contract. He even told us who to call." "Why didn't you?" Lauren asked. He looked toward the table where Crane sat, face tight with restrained disdain. "Because I was following orders," Mills said. "I shouldn't have." There was no further cross-examination. The defense didn't want to draw attention to someone who had already admitted the truth. Crane was called the following morning. He walked to the stand with careful precision. He adjusted his collar before sitting. He met every gaze with steady eyes and answered questions with crisp diction, the kind perfected by men who believed they still had control over how others perceived them. "I've served the Park Service for over 16 years, he began, after stating his name. "My record has been exemplary. My focus has always been on protecting the public and upholding the safety of our parks." Lauren approached slowly, not with aggression, but with the kind of quiet focus that didn't need to posture. Ranger Crane, you testified that you detained Mr. King because of inconsistencies in his documentation. What were those inconsistencies? Crane shifted slightly. There were no inconsistencies per se. The paperwork looked unofficial. I wasn't certain it had been properly filed. You received a laminated letter of authorization with Director Marsh's signature. Did you attempt to verify that signature? No, I didn't have access to the system in the field. Did you call her? I believed she was out of the office that day. Lauren turned a page in her binder. Director Marsh testified that she was in her office from 8:01 a.m. to 5:00 p.m. that day and received no attempt to contact her from your patrol. Crane blinked, then straightened. That's her recollection. Lauren lifted a copy of the day's call log records, admitted into evidence earlier that morning. No call was made from your field radio, department phone, or mobile device. I was trying to resolve the situation without escalating it further, he said, a defensive edge creeping into his voice now. I wanted to verify things calmly. But Mr. King wasn't escalating anything, correct? Crane hesitated. No, he remained calm, but he was evasive. In what way? He didn't offer a clear explanation for why he was in a remote area. Lauren stepped forward slightly. Did he say he was scouting for a veterans training program? He did. Did he show you a detailed terrain log and point to exact routes he had marked? Crane's jaw shifted. He had notes, yes. So when you say he was evasive, you mean he was calm, informed, prepared, and in possession of all required documentation, but not deferential enough for your liking? There was a pause. A flicker of discomfort passed across his face. Subtle, but there. I made a judgment call, Crane said firmly, based on what I saw and how he presented himself. Lauren nodded once. You've used that phrase before. How he presented himself. What exactly about his presentation suggested he didn't belong? Crane's face tightened. He was alone, dressed like someone used to tactical environments, no visible ranger credentials, and his attitude? Confident, dismissive. He didn't seem interested in cooperating. Lauren held his gaze now. Isn't it true that your reports described him as calm, compliant, and silent? Crane didn't respond. Do you equate silence with threat, Ranger? I equate lack of transparency with risk. Even when the individual presents valid ID, verified credentials, and offers a point of contact. Crane looked toward the jury. His jaw worked as if chewing the words before they left his mouth. I didn't feel like he respected my authority. Lauren let that hang in the air. There it was, the heart of the thing. Not fear, not confusion, just ego, cloaked in procedure. Thank you, she said. No further questions. As Crane stepped down, the courtroom didn't move. The silence wasn't dramatic. It was heavy, the kind that followed truth spoken too clearly to ignore. The trial continued with more testimonies, former employees, park visitors, whistleblowers who confirmed the culture that allowed men like Crane to act with impunity. But the jury had already felt the pivot. Crane hadn't been caught in a lie. He'd been caught in something worse. The truth he believed was defensible. And now the whole country could see it. By the fourth day of the trial, the courtroom no longer felt clinical. It had become something else entirely. Warmer in some places, tenser in others. The jury, once cautious and impassive, now leaned in when testimony began. Their pens scratched more often. Their glances shifted more frequently toward the defense table. No one said it aloud, but the direction of the current had changed. Truth had momentum now, and it was rolling forward with certainty. The last witness called before closing arguments was Director Allison Marsh. She walked to the stand in a tailored navy blazer, her hair pulled back in a low knot, eyes steady but alert. She had been in the background of this case from the beginning, authorizing Darius's contract, receiving his call after the incident, standing in the ranger station doorway when the damage had already been done. But now, her role was no longer administrative. It was personal. After she was sworn in, Lauren stepped forward. "Director Marsh, do you recall approving a terrain assessment contract with Darius King earlier this year?" "Yes," Marsh replied, her voice crisp. "I approved it myself. I reviewed the proposal, signed the authorization, and assigned field access clearance. Was that contract active on the day of Mr. King's detainment?" "It was. I confirmed it again later that afternoon." "Were you contacted by any ranger that morning to verify Mr. King's presence?" Marsh looked directly at the jury now. "No, not once. I was in my office from 8 a.m. until just after 5. I was reachable by office phone, direct line, and radio dispatch. No one contacted me." Lauren stepped closer. "What was your reaction when you learned Mr. King had been detained under suspicion?" "I was furious," Marsh said. "Not just because the procedure was ignored, but because someone I had personally contracted, someone I trusted to lead a national pilot program, was treated like a criminal for doing exactly what we had asked him to do." "Had Mr. King ever given your office any reason to doubt his professionalism or integrity?" "Never," Marsh said. "He's been exemplary, thorough, respectful, and committed to the work. He's exactly the kind of person this park system should be partnering with." Lauren nodded. "Do you believe, based on the evidence you've reviewed, that Mr. King was profiled?" A pause. Then, "Yes. I believe he was treated differently because of how he looked. I believe if he had been anyone else, anyone white, dressed the same way, walking the same path, he would not have been stopped, and certainly not detained." No cross-examination followed. The park's legal team declined. As Marsh stepped down and returned to her seat, Darius rose slowly from the plaintiff's table. Lauren turned to the judge, requesting permission for her client to address the court. It was granted. He stood without notes. "I've spent most of my life preparing other people for danger, for war zones, for disasters, for the kind of wilderness that pushes you to the edge of yourself and forces you to decide who you're going to be when no one's watching," he began. "But I never expected that after all that time, the hardest part would be walking a public trail in my own country." The courtroom was silent, not in obligation, but in reverence. "I didn't come here for punishment," Darius continued. "I came here for clarity. Because what happened to me wasn't an accident. It wasn't confusion. It was a choice, made by people who thought their authority was enough to cover their assumptions." He looked to the jury now, not with anger, but with something deeper, resolve sharpened by restraint. "This case isn't just about my story. It's about every person who's ever been asked to prove they belong in a space they've already earned. Every veteran who wears their service like armor just to feel safe walking alone. Every black hiker who brings a map, a compass, and a laminated contract, because we don't get the benefit of the doubt." He stepped back, his message complete. Lauren followed. Her closing was deliberate, free of flourish. She didn't appeal to emotion. She guided the jury back through every contradiction, every failure to act, every attempt by the defense to downplay what had become undeniable. "We've shown you the policies, we've shown you the procedures, and we've shown you how those were ignored, bent, and broken. But more than that, we've shown you the people affected by those choices. This trial isn't about making a statement. It's about making a change." She looked directly at the jury. "And change starts with a verdict." The jury deliberated for 5 hours. When they returned, the foreperson read the decision aloud. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Darius King." A single exhale passed through the courtroom. Not loud, not theatrical, just relief. Measured, dignified, earned. The court awarded damages, though Darius had already made it clear the amount was immaterial. What mattered was the ruling's final clause, an enforceable mandate requiring the Department of the Interior to implement the full suite of reform policies proposed in the trial, including third-party oversight, mandatory anti-bias training, and transparency reporting protocols. The following week, the department released an internal bulletin. Rangers Philip Crane and Ethan Mills were officially terminated. The memo cited repeated procedural misconduct and failure to uphold departmental standards. It was brief, clinical, but the message was clear. This wouldn't be buried. Darius didn't attend the press conference that followed. He sent a short written statement instead. Accountability is not revenge. It is responsibility. The outdoors belong to all of us. This verdict doesn't end the work. It begins it. That statement was printed in full on the front page of 3 national papers, and beside it, a photograph. Darius, standing once more at the base of the trail where it all began. Not as a defendant, not as a headline, but as a leader of something new. The air was different that morning, not because of the season, but because of what it marked. The trees stood tall as they always had, unmoved by headlines, verdicts, or news cameras. The trailhead was the same dirt-packed entry point Darius had crossed months ago, when he walked alone with a pack full of maps, a laminated contract, and the burden of being mistaken for a threat. But now, he wasn't alone. 47 veterans stood behind him, each wearing the deep green field shirt of Summit Reach, each with a pack strapped tight and boots laced firm. They were men and women of every background, every branch, every rank. Some wore prosthetics, some bore scars, others kept their eyes low and their speech quiet, having carried the weight of silence for years. But all of them had come to walk. And this time, no one would question why they were there. The first official wilderness retreat, now fully funded under the terms of the federal settlement, was no longer just a plan. It was happening. On this soil, on this trail, under these trees. The land hadn't changed, but the power on it had. Darius stood at the front of the group, not as a public figure, not as a victim-turned-activist, but as what he had always been, a leader, a builder, a man who had refused to be moved and instead moved something larger. He didn't give a speech, just a brief nod to the terrain team, a few sharp hand signals to the instructors spread out in the tree line, and then a glance over his shoulder at the veterans waiting to follow. "We walk together," he said, "and when we leave stronger." Then they started. The trail wound into the low valley, beneath an open sky filtered through pine and cedar. The air smelled of sap and soft earth, the kind of scent you didn't notice until you had spent too long breathing manufactured air. Every step was measured. Every silence was shared. No one asked what they were walking toward. They already knew. This was about reclamation, of space, of identity, of self. Over the next 3 days, they moved through changing terrain, climbing rock faces, fording shallow creeks, setting up base camp in zones where wild still meant unpredictable. They rotated leadership, made decisions as teams, treated wounds, and boiled water. They sat at night in a wide circle under the open stars, not to retell trauma, but to speak in plain truths without judgment. They weren't there to be fixed. They were there to remember they didn't need to be. Back in Washington, the changes Darius had fought for were beginning to take root. As part of the verdict handed down in open court, the Department of the Interior was given 30 days to issue its first public compliance report. It did so on time. The report confirmed what many had demanded from the beginning. Both rangers involved in the detainment, Philip Crane and Ethan Mills, were officially terminated from the Federal Park Service. The language used in the document was precise and unapologetic. Crane was cited for multiple violations of protocol, including failure to verify credentials, misrepresentation of field risk, and repeated profiling-based detainments that constituted systemic misconduct. Mills, while less culpable, was discharged for willful failure to intervene in an unlawful detainment despite access to mitigating information. But the consequences didn't stop with terminations. The department, in full compliance with the court's mandate, rolled out a new nationwide initiative requiring all park rangers and field officers to complete third-party administered anti-bias training. The training modules weren't just online slide decks or vague cultural awareness quizzes. They included scenario-based field simulations, behavioral audits, and measured accountability assessments. Performance in these sessions would be tied directly to annual evaluations, promotions, and pay grade advancement. Failure to complete the training in good faith could result in administrative suspension or permanent dismissal. More importantly, the department agreed to full transparency. All citizen complaints and detainments involving park personnel would now be logged in a centralized public-facing database, searchable by region, ranger name, and outcome. For the first time in the agency's history, there would be oversight with teeth. When the reform package was made public, Darius declined all interview requests. He issued a written statement through Summit Reach. Policies change systems. People change cultures. Both are necessary. We've taken a step forward. The rest will be measured by how far we're willing to walk. And he meant it. The retreat wrapped on the fourth day with a quiet ceremony. No ribbon cutting, no stage. Just a stone cairn built at the edge of the trail, each veteran laying a rock to mark the end of the journey. Not as a memorial to pain, but as a marker of return. Lauren joined them on the final evening, hiking in on foot with a small team carrying donated supplies. She stood beside Darius as the fire crackled low between them and the stars emerged one by one. "You know," she said, "I had 2 more witnesses lined up, just in case the jury hesitated." He raised an eyebrow. "You always prepare for the long fight." She nodded. "But they didn't need it. Crane gave them everything." Darius looked out at the tree line, where firelight flickered against the trunks like silent sentinels. "They always give themselves away eventually," he said. "All you have to do is wait." She turned to him. "So what's next?" "We scale," he said. "Utah, Colorado. Vermont's already on board. We've got interest from tribal lands looking to create hybrid programs. The goal is 50 retreats a year." Lauren smiled. "You're not thinking small." "Why would I?" She paused. "You do realize you're a national figure now." "I'm not," he said. "Summit Reach is. I just got the first map drawn." He wasn't wrong. In the months that followed, the Summit Reach model was replicated in 9 states. Federal parks began contracting veteran-led training instructors not only for retreats, but for community outreach, trail management, and law enforcement partnership building. The movement spread not by decree, but by proof, by visibility, by veterans walking where others once hesitated. And through it all, Darius never chased the spotlight. He led hikes. He trained new instructors. He stood back when others stepped forward. But whenever he was asked to explain what it all meant, why he fought, why he stayed, he always gave the same answer. Because we belong here. Not just in the courtroom, not just on the trail, but in the world. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.